Every single day, without even thinking about it, you reach for a roll of toilet paper. It's soft, it's white, it's perforated into neat little squares, and honestly, we take it completely for granted. But here's a question that might stop you mid-scroll. For most of human history, toilet paper simply did not exist. Not for kings, not for emperors, not for anyone. So what did people actually use? The answer involves sponges on sticks, corn cobs, seashells, a Wisconsin congressman, a very unlucky entrepreneur, and one Johnny Carson joke that accidentally triggered a nationwide panic. Yes, toilet paper has a history far weirder and far more fascinating than you'd ever expect. So let's rewind the clock and find out how humanity finally solved one of its oldest, most awkward problems. Let's start at the very beginning with the uncomfortable truth. Long before anyone thought of soft, quilted tissue, people used whatever was lying around. Leaves, grass, moss, snow, even seashells and stones. Historians believe that Neanderthals, tens of thousands of years ago, were already reaching for leaves out of pure necessity, even though leaves are neither soft nor particularly absorbent. Then there's ancient Greece, where people used something called ostraca, broken pieces of pottery with the edges smoothed down. Imagine using a piece of a broken flower pot. Not exactly comfortable. But the ancient Romans took things to a whole new and frankly disturbing level. They used what's known as a tersorium, a sea sponge attached to a stick, often kept soaking in a bucket of salt water or vinegar between uses. And here's the catch: in most Roman public latrines, that sponge wasn't personal. It was communal. Everyone shared it. In fact, the Roman philosopher Seneca once wrote about a gladiator who was so desperate to avoid the arena that he took his own life using the handle of that very sponge stick. That's how seriously people once had to think about bathroom hygiene. Meanwhile, in colonial America centuries later, people used corn cobs, old newspapers, and even pages from mail-order catalogs. There's actually a wonderfully odd detail here. In 1792, an American named Robert B. Thomas punched a hole through the corner of the Old Farmer's Almanac so it could hang from a hook in the outhouse. The idea? You could read a page and then put it to use. Multitasking, 18th century style. So clearly, humanity needed a better solution, and as it turns out, that solution had already been invented over 1,000 years earlier on the other side of the world. Here's a fact that surprises most people. Toilet paper isn't a modern Western invention at all. It's Chinese and it's ancient. Paper itself was invented in China around the 2nd century BCE, originally used for wrapping and padding. But by the 6th century CE, we have the first documented evidence of paper being used for personal hygiene. A Chinese scholar named Yen Qi wrote in 589 AD, "Paper on which there are quotations or commentaries from the 5 classics or the names of sages, I dare not use for toilet purposes." In other words, he was fine using paper in the bathroom, just not paper with anything sacred printed on it. Which tells us this practice was already common enough to write about. Fast forward to the 14th century, and things get even more impressive. By the early 1300s, Chinese manufacturers were producing an astonishing 10 million packages of toilet paper every single year, and each package contained anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 sheets. That's an industrial-scale operation, centuries before the West even considered the idea. And then there's the imperial family. In the 1390s, during the reign of the Hongwu Emperor, workers were ordered to produce thousands of sheets of toilet paper specifically for the royal household, and these weren't just plain sheets. Each sheet measured roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, and they were perfumed. Picture that for a second. The Emperor of China was using giant, scented squares of luxury paper, while the rest of the world was still figuring out how to use a corn cob. Talk about privilege. Even foreign visitors noticed. An Arab traveler who visited China in 851 AD wrote, with what sounds like genuine surprise, that the Chinese did not wash themselves with water after using the bathroom instead. They simply wiped with paper. To him, this was a completely foreign, almost baffling concept. To the Chinese, it had already been normal for centuries. So while the rest of the world was still centuries away from anything resembling toilet paper, China had already built an entire industry around it. So, if China had this figured out by the 1300s, why did it take the Western world another 500 years to catch on? Mainly because paper itself was expensive and hard to come by in Europe and America until the 1700s and 1800s. Once newspapers and mass-printed books became common, people simply started repurposing them, tearing out pages from old newspapers, catalogs and almanacs. Not glamorous, but functional. The real turning point came in 1857 in New York, thanks to a man named Joseph Gaiety. Gaiety is widely credited as the inventor of the first commercially packaged toilet paper in the Western world. He called it Gaiety's medicated paper, flat, loose sheets infused with aloe and sold in packages of 500 sheets for 50 cents. He was so proud of his creation that he actually printed his own name on every single sheet. Unfortunately for Gaiety, his product was a commercial flop. Most people simply weren't willing to pay for something they'd been getting for free from old newspapers. It's one of history's great ironic footnotes. The true inventor of modern toilet paper died without ever seeing his idea take off. That success would instead go to two other men, Seth Wheeler and the Scott brothers. In 1871, Wheeler patented the idea of perforated rolled paper, essentially creating the format we still use today. And in 1879, brothers Edward and Clarence Scott founded the Scott Paper Company, which would go on to sell the very first toilet paper in roll form. By 1890, their Waldorf brand rolls were already on store shelves across America. And just like that, after roughly 14 centuries of playing catch-up, the Western world finally had its own version of what China had perfected long, long ago. Now here's where the story takes a genuinely bizarre turn, because toilet paper wasn't just invented, it also caused a full-blown national panic. And the man responsible wasn't a scientist or a politician. He was a late-night comedian. In November 1973, a Wisconsin congressman named Harold Froelich released a statement warning about a possible future shortage of paper supplies for government offices. It was a small, technical, mostly forgettable announcement. But somewhere along the line, it caught the attention of the writers for The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. On December 19, 1973, in front of nearly 20 million viewers, Johnny Carson joked on air, "There is an acute shortage of toilet paper in the good old United States. We gotta quit writing on it." The audience laughed. Nobody thought much of it in the moment. But the very next day, something extraordinary happened. Americans across the country stormed supermarkets, buying every roll of toilet paper they could physically carry. Stores sold out within hours. Manufacturers, completely unprepared for the sudden demand, couldn't keep up, and the Scott Paper Company was forced to introduce a rationing system just to manage distribution. The wildest part? There had never actually been a real shortage. Carson had essentially manufactured a national crisis with a single joke, and the public's fear did the rest, turning a fictional shortage into a very real one, purely through panic buying. A month later, Carson addressed it directly on air, saying he never wanted to be remembered as the man who created a false toilet paper scare. If that story sounds familiar, it's because almost 50 years later, in 2020, the exact same thing happened again, this time triggered by a pandemic instead of a punchline. Toilet paper, it seems, has a strange and recurring power to expose our deepest anxieties.